The wrench slipped from Ben's greasy fingers as the ground shook beneath his workshop. Tools rattled on their shelves, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the unmistakable sound of metal tearing through atmosphere at dangerous speeds. Ben Carter had been fixing broken machines for 30 years on this forgotten moon, but he had never heard anything quite like that. Lucy poked her head out from under the transport they were repairing. Oil streaked her young face, and her brown hair was tied back with a piece of wire. "What was that noise, Ben?" Sounded like something big just crashed. Ben wiped his hands on his coveralls and walked to the workshop door. The settlement of Titan's Edge sprawled before him in the pale light of the distant gas giant. Most of the buildings were prefab units and converted shipping containers, home to maybe 300 souls who made their living salvaging scrap and fixing whatever the galaxy threw away. It was not much to look at, but it was home. Smoke rose from beyond the eastern ridge, black against the orange sky. Ben squinted and saw the twisted remains of what looked like a ship scattered across the rocky ground. The hull was unlike anything he had seen before, with smooth curves and a strange metallic surface that seemed to shift colors in the light. "Alien ship," he muttered. Lucy scrambled out from under the transport, her eyes wide with excitement. "Really? Should we go look?" Before Ben could answer, Mayor Harris came running down the main street, his face red and sweating. Behind him followed a small crowd of concerned settlers. Ben, you need to see this. There's been a crash, and we think there might be a survivor." Ben grabbed his medical kit from the workshop wall. He was not a doctor, but on a settlement like this, everyone learned basic first aid. "What kind of survivor?" "That's just it," Harris said, catching his breath. "We're not sure what it is. Looks young, maybe, but it's not human, that's for certain." The small group made their way across the rocky terrain toward the crash site. The ship had hit hard, leaving a deep gouge in the ground and scattering debris over a wide area. As they got closer, Ben could see that the vessel was small, maybe a single-person craft. The hull had cracked open like an egg, revealing a cramped interior filled with strange symbols and softly glowing panels. "There," Lucy pointed to a spot near the ship's nose. "I see movement." Ben approached carefully. Curled up against a piece of twisted metal was a small figure, no bigger than a 10-year-old child. At first glance, she might have been human, but her skin was covered in scales that caught the light like polished metal. They shifted from gold to deep red as she breathed, and her hair was pure white, falling in tangled waves around her face. She was unconscious, and Ben could see blood seeping from a gash on her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, and one of her arms was bent at an odd angle. Whatever she was hurt badly. "We should leave it alone," said Tom Wells, one of the older settlers. "Alien business means trouble. Always has, always will." Harris nodded nervously. "Tom's right. We don't know what kind of diseases it might carry, or if its people will come looking for it. Best to just walk away." Ben knelt beside the injured creature and checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, revealing irises that seemed to hold starlight. She looked at him with an expression of fear and pain, then whispered something in a musical language he did not understand. "She's just a kid," Ben said softly, hurt and scared. "It could be dangerous," Wells insisted. "Could be some kind of spy or weapon." Ben looked down at the small, broken figure and made a decision that would change his life forever. "Then I guess we'll find out. Lucy, help me get her back to the workshop." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Ben cleaned and bandaged the girl's wounds while Lucy prepared a makeshift bed in the workshop's back room. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in her strange language, sometimes staring at Ben with those ancient, starry eyes. By evening, her fever had broken, and she was able to sit up and drink some water. She studied Ben and Lucy with obvious curiosity, tilting her head like a bird when they spoke. When Ben offered her some of his dinner, a simple stew of vegetables and processed protein, she sniffed it carefully before taking a tiny bite. Her face lit up with surprise and delight. "I think she likes it," Lucy said with a grin. The girl pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Aria. Ben repeated the name, and she nodded eagerly. Then she pointed to him with a questioning look. "Ben," he said, touching his chest. "Ben, she repeated, her voice like wind chimes. Then she pointed to Lucy. "Lucy. Ben. Lucy." The girl smiled for the first time, and it transformed her entire face. Despite her scales and strange coloring, There was something unmistakably childlike about that smile. Over the following days, Arya proved to be a quick learner. She picked up basic words of galactic standard with remarkable speed, and showed an eager interest in everything around her. She watched Ben work with intense concentration, learning to hand him tools and sort spare parts. Her small hands were surprisingly strong and precise. Lucy took to teaching her about human customs and simple tasks around the workshop. Soon Arya was helping with basic repairs, her scales shimmering as she concentrated on her work. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that impressed even Ben. The other settlers remained wary, but even they began to warm to the strange child. She was polite and helpful, always ready with that brilliant smile. When old Mrs. Chen's heating unit failed, Arya worked alongside Ben to fix it, her small fingers able to reach places his could not. For 3 months, life in the settlement took on a new rhythm. Arya became part of Ben's small family, sleeping in the workshop's back room and eating meals with Ben and Lucy. She learned to laugh at Lucy's jokes and to sit quietly when Ben was thinking through a difficult repair. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. The ships appeared, without warning on a quiet morning. 3 massive vessels, sleek and powerful, bearing markings that Ben had never seen before. They settled into orbit around the moon like predators, and soon smaller shuttles began descending toward the settlement. Arya saw them first. She had been helping Ben organize his tool chest when her head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She said something in her own language, a word that sounded like a prayer or a curse. "Hide," she whispered in Galactic Standard, grabbing Ben's arm with desperate strength. "Please, Ben, hide." 15 years had passed since that terrible morning when the Imperial ships took Arya away. Ben's hair was now more gray than brown, and his hands moved a little slower than they used to. But his workshop still hummed with activity. The settlement had grown too, sprawling across 3 ridges now instead of 1, with nearly 1,000 residents who made their living from the steady stream of traders and salvagers who passed through. Lucy ran most of the day-to-day operations now. She had grown into a brilliant engineer, her reputation for solving impossible problems spreading across the sector. Pilots would detour weeks out of their way just to have her look at their engines, but Ben still did the delicate work, the repairs that required not just skill but understanding born from decades of experience. The workshop itself had expanded too. What had once been a single room was now a complex of interconnected buildings, filled with equipment salvaged from 100 different worlds. Ben had trained dozens of apprentices over the years, sending them out to start their own shops on distant colonies. But he had never trained another quite like Arya. He rarely spoke of her anymore, but Lucy sometimes caught him staring at the small collection of belongings he had kept from her time with them. A few pieces of her crashed ship carefully preserved, a drawing she had made of the 3 of them working together, a simple necklace made from spare wire that she had worn every day. The galaxy had changed in those 15 years. The Draconic Imperium, once content to rule their core systems, had begun expanding aggressively. They demanded tribute from smaller civilizations and annexed any system that refused to comply. Humanity, despite their contributions to galactic technology, remained largely ignored. Most human colonies existed on the fringes, too small to be worth conquering, too scattered to be a threat. This suited many humans just fine. They had learned to thrive in the spaces between the great powers, making themselves useful without making themselves targets. Human engineers were sought after throughout the galaxy. Human merchants could trade where others could not, and human colonies served as neutral ground where different species could meet safely. Ben's workshop had become one such meeting place. Traders from a dozen different species would gather in his waiting area, sharing news and making deals while their ships were repaired. He had learned bits and pieces of many languages over the years, enough to negotiate prices and understand problems, but he had never forgotten the musical sound of Arya's voice. The warning came on a Tuesday evening, just as Ben was finishing work on a particularly stubborn fusion drive. Lucy burst through the workshop door, her face pale with worry. "Ben, you need to see this. The long-range sensors are picking up something big heading our way. Really big." Ben wiped his hands and followed her to the communications center that the settlement had built as it grew. The technician on duty, a young man named Peter, was staring at his displays with obvious confusion. "I've never seen readings like this," Peter said. "It's not just one ship. It's a whole fleet. Maybe 50 vessels, some of them huge. They'll be here in less than 6 hours. Ben studied the sensor data. The ships were moving in perfect formation, their energy signatures unlike anything in the databases. Any idea who they are? That's the weird part, Peter replied. They're broadcasting Imperial identification codes, but they're not responding to our hails. They're just coming straight for us. Word spread quickly through the settlement. Large fleets usually meant bad news for frontier colonies. They could be pirates looking for easy targets, military forces conscripting workers, or corporate raiders claiming new territory. Whatever they wanted, the people of Titan's Edge had learned that running was often safer than fighting. Families began packing their most precious possessions into small ships and transports. The asteroid belt beyond the moon offered hundreds of hiding places for those who knew where to look. But Ben found himself strangely reluctant to leave. This was his home, his workshop, his life's work. He was too old to start over somewhere else. Lucy refused to leave without him. If you're staying, I'm staying, she said firmly. We'll face whatever comes together. As the hours passed, more details became clear. The approaching fleet was definitely Imperial, but not from any of the local sectors. These ships came from the core systems, the heart of draconic space. Their technology was more advanced than anything seen on the frontier. Most of the settlement's population had evacuated by the time the fleet arrived. Only about 100 people remained, mostly those like Ben who had nowhere else to go or who were too stubborn to leave. They gathered in the main square as the massive ships took position in orbit overhead. The ships were beautiful in a terrifying way. Their hulls were smooth and elegant, designed for both speed and power. They moved with perfect precision, forming a defensive perimeter around the moon as if they expected an attack. But no attack came. The small frontier settlement posed no threat to such a force. Ben stood in the square with the other remaining settlers, looking up at the alien vessels with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mayor Harris, who had also refused to evacuate, kept glancing at Ben with a worried expression. Everyone knew about Ben's encounter with the Dragon Girl 15 years ago. Some wondered if that old incident had finally caught up with them. A single shuttle detached from the largest ship and began descending toward the settlement. It was smaller than the warships, but still impressive, its hull decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the light. As it settled into the square, the settlers backed away nervously. The shuttle's door opened with a soft hiss, and a figure emerged that made Ben's heart stop. She was tall now. Her scales a deep crimson shot through with veins of gold. She wore a uniform that spoke of high rank and absolute authority, and her bearing was that of someone accustomed to command. But her eyes, those same ancient eyes that held starlight, searched the crowd until they found his. "Hello, Ben," she said, her voice still musical but now carrying the weight of power. "I told you I would never forget your kindness." The settlers stared in shock as the Imperial Princess walked directly toward the old mechanic, her retinue of guards and advisors following at a respectful distance. This was not conquest or tribute collection. This was something unprecedented in the history of galactic politics. Ben found his voice at last. "Arya, is it really you?" She smiled, and for a moment the powerful princess seemed to fade away, replaced by the frightened child who had once helped him sort spare parts. "I promised I would come back, didn't I? Though I admit it took me longer than I hoped." Around them, the remaining settlers watched in stunned silence as one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy bowed respectfully to a human mechanic on a backwater moon. The implications would ripple across the galaxy, but for now, there were only two old friends greeting each other after a very long separation. "You've grown," Ben said with a slight smile. "So have you," Arya replied, noting his grayed hair and lined face. "But you're still the same kind man who took in a lost child without asking for anything in return." Lucy stepped forward cautiously. "Arya, you remember me?" "Of course, Lucy. My best teacher and my dearest sister." Arya embraced the young woman warmly. "I have missed you both more than you can know." Ben looked around at the massive fleet in orbit, then back at Arya's confident bearing and military uniform. "I take it you've done well for yourself." Arya's expression grew serious. "I have, but it has not been easy, and I'm afraid my success has created some complications for you. We have much to discuss, old friend. Much to discuss indeed." The workshop felt smaller now with Arya in it. Not because she was large, but because the sheer presence of power seemed to fill every corner. She moved with the controlled grace of someone who had learned to command fleets and decide the fate of worlds. Yet she still paused to examine the old tool chest where she had once helped sort spare parts. Ben served tea in the same chipped cups they had used 15 years ago. Arya accepted hers with a smile that reminded him of the child who had delighted in simple human customs. Lucy sat quietly in the corner, still trying to process that their long-lost friend had returned as an imperial princess. "Tell me what happened," Ben said gently, "after they took you away." Arya's expression darkened as she cradled the warm cup in her hands. "I was taken back to the imperial capital, to a world I barely remembered. The court had given me up for dead, and my absence had created a crisis. Several noble houses were fighting over the succession, each claiming the right to rule our system." She paused, staring into her tea as if seeing the past reflected there. "I was thrust into a world of politics and intrigue that I was completely unprepared for. Everyone wanted to use me for their own purposes. Some tried to marry me off to secure alliances. Others wanted me to renounce my claim so their candidates could take power." Ben listened with growing concern. The child he had sheltered had been thrown into a nest of vipers. "How did you survive?" "I almost didn't," Arya admitted. "For the first year I barely spoke. I was so angry at being taken away from you and Lucy, so overwhelmed by the complexity of imperial politics. I spent most of my time hiding in the palace archives, reading about our history, and learning about the galaxy beyond our borders." Lucy leaned forward. "What changed?" "I found records of my grandfather's reign," Arya said, her voice growing stronger. He had been different from other imperial rulers. Instead of conquering through fear alone, he had built alliances. He had shown that strength could come from unity rather than domination. But his ideas had been forgotten after his death. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at her fleet in orbit. "I realized that I could either become another tyrant in a long line of tyrants, or I could try to become the kind of leader my grandfather had been. The kind of leader you showed me was possible, Ben." Ben frowned, confused. "What do you mean? You ruled this workshop, didn't you? People came to you with their problems, and you fixed them. You never used fear or violence to get your way. You led through competence and kindness. When I was scared and lost, you protected me without asking what I could give you in return." Arya turned back to face him. "You showed me that true strength comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down." The implications of her words began to sink in. "You've been trying to change the Empire?" "I've been trying to change everything," Arya said. "But it's been slow work. I had to prove myself first, had to show that I was strong enough to lead. I spent years in the military academy, learning strategy and tactics. Then more years commanding small fleets, building a reputation as someone who could win battles." Lucy asked the obvious question. "Did you win?" "More than I lost," Arya replied with a slight smile. "But every victory came at a cost. Every time I showed mercy when others expected brutality. Every time I chose negotiation over conquest. I made enemies within my own ranks. There are many in the Empire who think I'm weak." Ben studied her face, seeing the weight of years and difficult decisions in her expression. "But you kept going." "I kept going because I had a goal. I wanted to create an empire worthy of the kindness you showed me. An empire where a lost child could find help without fear, where different species could work together as equals." She set down her cup and looked directly at Ben. "But I'm afraid my efforts to honor your example have put you in danger." The temperature in the workshop seemed to drop. "What kind of danger?" Arya moved to the door and gestured to one of her guards, who brought in a small data pad. "Our intelligence networks have been monitoring communications across the galaxy. Your name has appeared in at least a dozen different reports over the past year." She activated the device, and holographic displays filled the air above it. Ben saw transcripts of conversations, shipping manifests, and what looked like surveillance reports. His own face appeared in several of the images. "Word has spread about the mechanic who sheltered an imperial princess," Arya explained. "Some see this as an opportunity. They think that by gaining your favor, they can influence me. Others see you as a security risk, someone who knows too much about imperial affairs." Lucy stood up abruptly. "That's ridiculous. Ben doesn't know anything about imperial politics." "But I do," Arya said quietly. "And I've made it clear that your kindness shaped my entire approach to leadership. That makes Ben a very valuable person to some very dangerous people." Ben felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of people? Trade Federation syndicates who want to negotiate better deals with the Empire. Rebel groups who think they can use you to get to me. Rival Imperial houses who see you as either an asset to acquire or a threat to eliminate. Arya's voice grew grim. 3 separate intelligence agencies have sent operatives to this sector in the past 6 months. All of them are interested in the mechanic who befriended a princess. The workshop fell silent except for the hum of equipment and the distant sound of Lucy's breathing. Ben had always known that helping Arya might have consequences someday, but he had never imagined anything like this. "I'm sorry," Arya said, and for a moment she sounded like the frightened child she had once been. "I never meant for my gratitude to put you in danger, but it's too late to change what's already been set in motion." Ben stood and walked to his workbench, running his hands over tools he had used for decades. "So what do we do?" "I've brought my fleet here for 2 reasons," Arya said, her voice regaining its authority. "First, to ensure that no one can threaten you or this settlement. My ships will establish a permanent protective presence in this system." Lucy looked confused. "Permanent? Won't that cause problems with your superiors?" Arya smiled, but it was not entirely pleasant. "That brings me to the second reason. I'm not just here to protect you, Ben. I'm here to announce a new policy for the Empire. This settlement, and the human colonies that choose to join us, will become the first members of what I'm calling the Allied Systems Initiative." Ben turned back to face her. "What does that mean?" "It means that instead of conquest and tribute, the Empire will offer partnership and mutual benefit. Humans will have the protection of Imperial fleets, access to our technology and trade networks. In return, you'll provide what you've always provided: engineering expertise, neutral ground for diplomacy, and innovative solutions to complex problems." The scope of what she was proposing began to dawn on. "Benny, you're talking about changing the fundamental structure of the Empire." "I'm talking about evolution," Arya replied. "The old ways of ruling through fear are failing. The galaxy is too complex, too diverse for one species to dominate through force alone. We need allies, not subjects. Partners, not slaves." Lucy whistled softly. "That's going to make you a lot of enemies." "It already has," Arya admitted. "But it's also gaining support from unexpected quarters. There are many within the Empire who are tired of constant warfare, tired of ruling through fear. And there are many outside the Empire who would prefer alliance to conquest." Ben walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. "And you want to start all of this here? On Titan's Edge? Where else?" Arya asked. "This is where I learned that different species can work together as equals. This is where a human mechanic showed kindness to an alien child without expecting anything in return. If we can make it work here, we can make it work anywhere." She knelt beside his chair, taking his weathered hands in her scaled ones. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Ben. You just wanted to fix engines and live in peace. But sometimes the galaxy doesn't give us that choice. Sometimes we have to choose between safety and what's right." Ben looked into those ancient, starry eyes and saw the same determination that had once driven a frightened child to help him sort spare parts. Despite her injuries, "What do you need from me?" "Be yourself," Arya said simply. "Be the kind, honest man who saw a scared child and chose to help. Let me show the galaxy what human values can accomplish when they're backed by Imperial power." Outside, the massive fleet waited in orbit, ready to reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. But in the small workshop where it all began, 3 friends sat together and planned the future over cups of tea, just as they had 15 years ago. The news reached them 3 days later through encrypted Imperial channels. Ben was working on a damaged navigation computer when Arya's communication officer brought the urgent message. The young draconic officer's scales had turned pale with worry as he handed over the datapad. "What is it?" Ben asked, noting Arya's grim expression as she read the message. "The Imperial Council has called for an emergency session," Arya said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They want me to explain why I've deployed a significant portion of the Third Fleet to protect a human settlement without authorization." Lucy looked up from the engine she was repairing. "Can they order you back?" "They can try," Arya replied. "But I command the loyalty of my fleet, and my actions are within my authority as a sector commander. The real problem is what this represents. There are factions within the Empire that have been waiting for an excuse to challenge my policies." Ben set down his tools and gave Arya his full attention. "What kind of challenge?" Arya moved to the workshop's main display and activated a holographic map of the galaxy. Red markers indicated Imperial territory, Blue showed independent systems and green represented the various trade federations and alliances. The Empire has been expanding for 3 centuries through conquest and intimidation. My approach of offering alliance instead of demanding submission threatens the traditional power structure. She highlighted several systems near the imperial core. These noble houses have built their wealth and influence on the old system. They control entire sectors through fear and tribute. If my alliance initiative succeeds, it proves there's a better way to build an empire. Lucy frowned. And that threatens them how? If the outer systems see that they can prosper through alliance rather than submission, they might start demanding better treatment, Ben said, beginning to understand. The core systems would lose their advantage. Exactly, Arya confirmed. Lord Commander Drax has been the most vocal opponent. He controls the Second Fleet and has significant influence in the Council. He's been arguing that my policies show weakness and encourage rebellion. The implications were clear. Arya had put herself in a dangerous position by protecting Titan's edge. Ben felt the familiar weight of responsibility that he had carried since that first day, when he chose to help an injured. Child, this is my fault, he said quietly. If I hadn't helped you back then, none of this would be happening. Arya turned to face him, her expression fierce. Don't you dare apologize for showing kindness. That kindness changed my life and gave me a vision of what the Empire could become. If we abandon that vision now, then Drax and his supporters win. Before Ben could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the settlement. The communication officer pressed his hand to his earpiece, listening to an urgent report. Princess, long-range sensors are detecting an approaching fleet. 27 vessels flying Second Fleet colors. Arya's expression hardened. Drax, he's coming to test my resolve. The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Arya's ships moved into defensive positions while the settlement's population was evacuated to secure bunkers. Ben found himself in the strange position of being protected by one of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy, while feeling completely helpless. The Second Fleet arrived with military precision, taking position just outside the range of Arya's weapons. Their ships were older than Arya's, but still formidable, designed for intimidation as much as warfare. The flagship was a massive dreadnought that dwarfed even Arya's command vessel. Incoming transmission, the communication officer reported. The workshop's main display activated, showing the bridge of the Second Fleet flagship. Lord Commander Drax was exactly what Ben had expected from Arya's description, a massive draconic figure with dark scales and cold, calculating eyes. His uniform bore the insignia of ancient nobility and military authority. Princess Arya, Drax said, his voice carrying the weight of aristocratic privilege. You will stand down your fleet and return to the capital immediately. Your unauthorized deployment ends now. Arya stood in the center of Ben's workshop, every inch the Imperial commander despite the humble surroundings. Lord Commander Drax, I was not aware that the Second Fleet had business in this sector. The Council has authorized me to restore order to this region, Drax replied. Your experiment in alien cooperation has gone too far. These humans must be returned to their proper status as protected tributaries. Ben felt a chill at the casual way Drax referred to humans as property to be managed. This was the attitude Arya had been fighting against, and now it stood before them in all its arrogant certainty. The humans of Titan's Edge are under my personal protection as allies of the Empire, Arya said firmly. Any action against them is an action against me. Drax's laugh was cold and dismissive. You forget yourself, Princess. You may command a fleet, but you are still accountable to the Council. These aliens have no place in civilized society except as servants. These aliens are our partners, Arya shot back. They've contributed more to Imperial prosperity in 3 days than most tributary worlds contribute in a year. It was true. Since Arya's arrival, human engineers had already solved 2 long-standing problems with Imperial ship designs. Lucy had developed improvements to their power systems that increased efficiency by 12%. Ben had figured out how to repair damaged hull plating using locally available materials, saving both time and resources. Clever slaves are still slaves, Drax said dismissively. The Council has decided that your policies pose a threat to Imperial stability. You will withdraw your protection from this world and return these humans to their proper status. Ben saw Arya's hands clench into fists, her scales shifting to a darker red that indicated rising anger. And if I refuse? Then I will carry out the Council's orders myself, Drax replied. Your ships are outnumbered, Princess. Don't force a confrontation you cannot win. The transmission ended, leaving the workshop in tense silence. Outside, Ben could see Arya's ships moving into combat formation while the Second Fleet did the same. Two Imperial fleets were preparing to fight each other over the fate of a human settlement. And it was all because he had chosen to help a frightened child 15 years ago. "Call his bluff," Lucy said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "What?" "Call his bluff," she repeated, her voice gaining confidence. "Drax is here to intimidate you into backing down. He doesn't want to fight you any more than you want to fight him. An Imperial civil war would be a disaster for everyone." Arya considered this. "You think he's hoping I'll surrender without a fight?" "I think he's hoping you'll compromise," Ben said, understanding Lucy's reasoning. "Give him something he can take back to the Council as a victory while you keep what's really important." But Arya shook her head. "There is no compromise here. Either humans are equals and allies, or they're subjects and slaves. Either the Empire evolves or it stagnates. There's no middle ground." Ben walked to the window and looked up at the fleets facing each other in the void above. "Then we'd better hope your crews are as loyal as you think they are." "They are," Arya said with absolute certainty. "Every captain in my fleet chose to serve under me because they believe in what we're building. They've seen what Alliance can accomplish. They won't back down." The test came an hour later. A single ship from Drax's fleet, a heavy cruiser, broke formation and began moving toward the settlement. It was a probe, testing Arya's resolve and the loyalty of her captains. Arya's response was swift and decisive. 3 of her ships moved to intercept, their weapons powered but not yet aimed. The message was clear. Any attempt to threaten the settlement would be met with force. The Second Fleet cruiser stopped just outside weapons range, neither advancing nor retreating. For long minutes, the two forces faced each other while the galaxy held its breath. Then something unexpected happened. The cruiser began transmitting on an open channel, broadcasting a message that reached every ship in both fleets. "This is Captain Rex of the Imperial Cruiser Vengeance. I hereby request permission to transfer my allegiance to Princess Arya's fleet. My crew and I believe in the Alliance initiative and refuse to participate in actions against innocent civilians." Ben stared at the display in amazement as the massive warship broke away from Drax's formation and moved toward Arya's fleet. Then another ship followed, and another. By the end of the day, 7 ships from the Second Fleet had switched sides, their crews choosing Arya's vision of the future over Drax's adherence to the past. Drax retreated with the remainder of his fleet, but not before sending one final message. "This isn't over, Princess. The Council will hear of your rebellion." As the enemy ships jumped to hyperspace, Ben realized that the confrontation had changed everything. There could be no going back now. Arya had chosen her path, and she would either transform the Empire or be destroyed by it. "So what happens now?" he asked. Arya looked at him with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Now we show the galaxy what we can build together, and we hope it's enough to survive what's coming." The formal ceremony took place in the main square of Titan's Edge, but it was broadcast across the galaxy. Representatives from 12 human colonies had arrived to witness what would become known as the Titan Accords, the first formal alliance between the Draconic Empire and an independent species based on equality rather than conquest. Ben stood uncomfortably in his best clothes, still not quite believing that he was about to become the first human ambassador to the Imperial Court. Beside him, Lucy wore the insignia of Chief Technical Advisor, a position Arya had created specifically for her expertise in bridging human and draconic technology. "I never signed up for this," Ben muttered as Arya approached in her formal court regalia. "None of us signed up for this," Lucy replied. "But here we are anyway." Arya looked magnificent in her ceremonial armor, each scale polished to mirror brightness. The armor itself was a symbol of her new philosophy, combining traditional draconic designs with human engineering improvements. It was both beautiful and functional, representing the synthesis of 2 civilizations. "Citizens of the galaxy," Arya began, her voice carrying across the square and through transmission networks to billions of beings on thousands of worlds. "Today marks the beginning of a new era. For too long, our empire has grown through conquest and fear. Today, we choose a different path." She gestured to Ben and Lucy, then to the human representatives who had gathered from across the frontier. "These are not our subjects or our tributaries. They are our partners and our allies. Together we will build something greater than either of our peoples could achieve alone." The response was immediate and divided. Some systems celebrated the news, particularly those on the imperial frontier who had lived in fear of conquest. Others, especially in the core systems, viewed it as weakness and betrayal of imperial traditions. Over the following weeks, the settlement transformed into a diplomatic hub. Species that had been enemies for generations sat down at the same negotiating tables with humans serving as neutral mediators. Ben's workshop became an unofficial embassy, where disputes were settled over cups of tea and complex engineering problems. The first real test came when the Trade Federation challenged the Accords. They claimed that humanity was already bound by existing treaties that classified them as a protected but subordinate species under galactic law. Any alliance with the Empire violated these agreements and threatened the established order. The Federation fleet that arrived was impressive, 15 heavy cruisers led by a massive command ship. Their admiral, a cold-eyed reptilian named Kos, demanded that the humans be returned to their proper status immediately. Ben found himself standing beside Arya on the bridge of her flagship as the Federation ships took position around the moon. It was surreal to be in such a place, surrounded by technology beyond his understanding, preparing for a confrontation that could reshape galactic politics. "Admiral Kos," Arya said as the communication channel opened, "you are not welcome in this system. The humans here are under Imperial protection." "Princess Arya," Kos replied, his voice dripping with disdain, "surely you understand the legal implications of what you've done. These creatures are bound by Federation treaties. You cannot simply declare them independent." Ben felt anger rising at being referred to as a creature, but Arya's response was swift and cutting. "These humans are citizens of independent colonies that have chosen to ally with the Empire. They are not your property to be traded and managed." "Property?" Kos laughed harshly. "They are barely more than animals. Useful for simple tasks, perhaps, but hardly worthy of equal treatment with civilized beings." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Ben saw Arya's scales darken with fury, and he realized that this moment would define everything that followed. How she responded would show the galaxy what kind of empire she intended to build. "Admiral Kos," Arya said, her voice deadly calm, "you will apologize for that insult immediately." "I will not apologize for stating biological fact," Kos replied arrogantly. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations. Arya's fleet moved with perfect coordination, surrounding the Federation ships before they could react. The maneuver was executed so smoothly that the Federation barely had time to raise their shields. "Admiral," Arya continued, "you have insulted my allies and dishonored yourself. You will leave this system immediately, or I will demonstrate just how effective these animals can be in combat." It was not an idle threat. Human engineers had been working with Arya's crews for weeks, improving weapon systems and developing new tactical approaches. The Federation ships were outnumbered and outgunned, facing technology they had never encountered before. Kos tried to maintain his arrogance. "You would start a war over these primitives." "I would end one," Arya replied. "The age of treating sapient beings as property is over, Admiral. You can accept that gracefully, or you can learn it the hard way." The standoff lasted for hours. Federation reinforcements were too far away to help, and every minute that passed made their position more precarious. Finally, Kos made the only sensible choice. "This matter is not settled, Princess. The Federation will not forget this insult. Neither will the Empire," Arya replied as the Federation ships retreated. The confrontation sent shockwaves across the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, someone had successfully challenged the Federation's authority over lesser species. More importantly, it demonstrated that Arya was willing to back her words with force. The effects were immediate. Representatives from dozens of species began arriving at Titan's Edge, seeking audiences with the princess who had dared to rewrite the rules of galactic politics. Some came seeking alliance, others hoping to understand this new dynamic, and a few clearly planning to exploit the changing situation. Ben found his workshop constantly full of alien visitors, each trying to understand how a simple human mechanic had become so influential. He answered their questions as best he could, explaining that his only secret was treating everyone with basic decency and respect. Lucy thrived in the new environment, working with engineers from a dozen different species to solve problems that had plagued the galaxy for generations. The combination of human creativity and alien resources proved remarkably effective. But success brought new challenges. The traditional powers viewed Arya's alliance as a threat to their dominance. Intelligence reports indicated that several major factions were coordinating their response, preparing to crush this experiment before it could spread. The crisis came to a head when urgent communications arrived from the Imperial capital. The Council had voted to recall Arya immediately, and Lord Commander Drax had been authorized to use force if necessary. More ominously, traditional allies of humanity were distancing themselves, afraid of being caught in the crossfire of Imperial politics. "They're forcing a choice," Arya explained to Ben and Lucy as they studied the latest intelligence reports. "Either I abandon the alliance and return to traditional Imperial policies, or I face charges of treason and rebellion." Ben set down his cup of tea and looked at the young woman who had once been a frightened child in his workshop. "What will you do?" "I'll go back," Arya said firmly. "But not alone. It's time for humanity to have a voice in Imperial politics. It's time for the galaxy to see what we've built here." Lucy leaned forward. "You want to take Ben to the Imperial capital?" "I want to take humanity's first ambassador to address the Imperial Council," Arya corrected. "It's a risk, but it's also an opportunity. If we can convince the Council to support the alliance, we can transform the Empire from within." Ben stared at her in horror. "You want me to speak to the Imperial Council? I'm just a mechanic, Arya. I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy." "You know about treating people with respect," Arya replied. "You know about solving problems through cooperation instead of force. You know about building trust and working together toward common goals. Those are exactly the skills we need." The decision was not easy. Going to the Imperial capital meant leaving the safety of Arya's fleet and entering a political arena where a single mistake could be fatal. But staying on Titan's edge meant accepting that their alliance was too weak to survive its first real test. In the end, Ben made the same choice he had made 15 years ago, when he first saw an injured child who needed help. He would do what was right, regardless of the consequences. "When do we leave?" he asked. Arya smiled, and for a moment she looked like the eager child who had once helped him sort spare parts. "Tomorrow. We have an empire to save." The Imperial capital was beyond anything Ben had imagined. The planet itself was a work of art, with cities that floated among the clouds and spires that reached toward the stars. Ancient dragons had built this world over thousands of years, creating architecture that was both beautiful and impossibly vast. Ships the size of cities moved through the atmosphere like birds, and the palace complex alone was larger than most human colonies. Ben stood on the observation deck of Arya's flagship as they approached the capital, trying to process the scale of what he was seeing. Lucy stood beside him, equally overwhelmed by the sight of a civilization that had mastered both technology and artistry on a level that humanity had never achieved. "Second thoughts?" Arya asked, joining them at the viewport. "Many," Ben admitted. "But I'm here now." The docking process alone took hours. Arya's fleet was met by an escort of Imperial Guard vessels, their hulls gleaming with ceremonial decorations. The message was clear. This was both an honor guard and a warning. The princess was welcome, but she was also under scrutiny. The palace itself defied description. Corridors stretched for kilometers, filled with art and architecture from across the galaxy. Gravity generators allowed for impossible geometries, with walkways that curved up walls and chambers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Ben felt like an ant crawling through a cathedral designed for giants. Their quarters were luxurious beyond anything Ben had experienced, but he noticed the subtle security measures. Guards were posted at every entrance, and their communications were clearly being monitored. They were honored guests, but they were also prisoners until the council reached its decision. The Imperial Council convened in a chamber that could have held a small city. Hundreds of nobles, military commanders, and planetary governors sat in tiers that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadows. At the center sat the Empress herself, an ancient dragon whose age was measured in millennia rather than centuries. Ben had never felt smaller than when he walked into that chamber, representing not just humanity but the future of galactic civilization. He wore his best formal clothes, but he was still obviously a simple mechanic among beings who commanded star systems and controlled the fate of billions. Arya took her place among the nobles with practiced grace, but Ben could see the tension in her posture. Everything they had worked for would be decided here, in this moment, by beings who had never known what it meant to struggle for survival or work with their Hands Lord Commander Drax stood to present the charges against Arya. His voice echoed through the vast chamber as he accused her of treason, of elevating primitive species above their natural station, and of weakening the Empire through misguided compassion. The princess has forgotten that the Empire exists to serve dragons, not aliens, Drax declared. She has placed the interests of lesser beings above the safety and prosperity of our own people. This cannot be tolerated. Other nobles spoke in support of Drax's position. They painted Arya as naive and dangerous, arguing that her policies would lead to rebellion and chaos. They spoke of humans as useful tools at best, dangerous parasites at worst. Ben listened to these speeches with growing anger. These beings had never worked alongside humans, never seen their ingenuity and dedication. They judged an entire species based on prejudice and ignorance. When Arya was finally allowed to speak in her own defense, she stood with quiet dignity and addressed the council with the authority she had earned through years of military service and political struggle. Honored counselors, she began, I stand accused of weakening the Empire through alliance with humanity. I submit to you that the opposite is true. I have strengthened the Empire by showing that our power comes not from fear, but from the willing cooperation of those who share our vision. She gestured to Ben, who stood at the designated place for witnesses and advisors. This human mechanic saved my life when I was powerless and lost. He asked for nothing in return, expected no reward, sought no advantage. He helped me because it was right to help. That simple act taught me more about true strength than all my military training. The chamber murmured with discussion as Arya continued. In 3 months of alliance, human engineers have improved our ship designs, solved logistics problems that have plagued us for decades, and opened new possibilities for expansion through cooperation rather than conquest. This is not weakness. This is evolution. But when the time came for Ben to address the council, he knew that Arya's words, however eloquent, would not be enough. These beings respected only strength, and they saw kindness as weakness. He would have to speak in terms they could understand. Your Majesties, Ben began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite his nervousness. I am just a mechanic from a frontier settlement. I fix broken things for a living. But I have learned something in my 60 years that I think you need to hear. He paused, looking around at the assembled nobles with their scales gleaming in the chamber's light. The strongest materials are not the hardest ones. The strongest materials are the ones that can bend without breaking, that can absorb stress and distribute it without failing. What you call weakness, I call flexibility. What you call compromise, I call engineering. Ben pointed toward a decorative arch that spanned part of the chamber. That arch stands not because the stones are harder than everything else, but because they support each other. Remove one stone and the whole structure fails. The empire you've built is like a single massive stone. It seems strong, but it's brittle. One crack and it shatters. The chamber fell silent as Ben continued. What Princess Arya is building is different. It's an arch where every species, every world, every individual supports the others. It's not weaker because it includes humans or any other species. It's stronger because it distributes the load. He looked directly at Lord Commander Drax. You say that allying with humans weakens the Empire, but in the last month, human innovations have increased the efficiency of your fleets by 15%. Human mediation has resolved conflicts that were draining Imperial resources. Human colonies have begun contributing to Imperial prosperity instead of simply taking from it. Ben's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. You can continue ruling through fear, demanding tribute and crushing anyone who opposes you. But that path leads to rebellion and eventual collapse. Every empire in history that relied solely on force has fallen when they encountered something stronger. He gestured toward Arya. Or you can choose evolution. You can choose to build something that lasts not because it's feared, but because it's worth preserving. You can choose to lead a galaxy that works together instead of one that's held together by chains. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some nobles were clearly outraged by Ben's presumption in lecturing them. Others seemed thoughtful considering his words. But the Empress herself remained silent, her ancient eyes studying Ben with an expression he could not read. The debate continued for hours. Noble after noble stood to argue for or against Arya's policies. Military commanders presented strategic analyses. Economists discussed trade implications. But Ben noticed that the most telling support came from an unexpected source. Captain Rex, who had switched sides during the confrontation with Drax's fleet, stood to address the council. Your Majesties, I have served the Empire for 30 years. I have seen what fear can accomplish, and I have seen its limits. In 3 months under Princess Arya's command, my crew has achieved more than in 3 years under traditional leadership. Not because we are stronger, but because we are united. Other military officers who had served under Arya stood to echo his words. They spoke of improved morale, better coordination, and successful missions that had been accomplished through alliance rather than force. The tide began to turn when the Empress finally spoke. Her voice was ancient and powerful, carrying the weight of millennia of rule. We have heard much debate about strength and weakness, she said, and the chamber fell silent. But we have ruled this empire for longer than any of you have been alive. We have seen empires rise and fall, and we know the difference between true strength and mere brutality. She stood, her massive form dominating the chamber. Princess Arya has not weakened the empire. She has shown us a path to make it truly eternal. The mechanic speaks truth. An empire built on fear will eventually face something it cannot frighten. An empire built on cooperation will find allies where others find only enemies. The vote was closer than Ben had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. Arya's policies were officially approved, and the alliance initiative became formal imperial doctrine. Humanity was recognized as the first equal partner in what would become a new model for galactic civilization. But the most important moment came after the ceremony, when Ben found himself alone with the Empress in her private chambers. The ancient dragon studied him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. You spoke well, mechanic, she said, but do you understand what you have set in motion? Ben considered his words carefully. I think so, Your Majesty. Change is never easy, and there will be those who resist what we're building, but I believe it's the right path. The Empress smiled, an expression both terrible and beautiful on her ancient features. 15 years ago, we arranged for young Arya's ship to malfunction near your settlement. We needed to know if she possessed the wisdom to rule an empire that would face challenges we could not imagine. Ben stared at her in shock. You planned it? We planned for her to be tested, the Empress corrected. We did not plan for her to find a teacher who would reshape her understanding of power itself. That was fortune beyond our design. She moved to a window that looked out over the vast capital. The galaxy is changing, mechanic. New technologies, new species making contact, new challenges that cannot be met with the old ways. We needed a successor who could adapt, who could build bridges instead of walls. The implication was clear. Arya was being groomed not just as a military commander, but as the future ruler of the empire itself.
Will she be ready?
Ben asked. She will be ready because she learned from you that true strength comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down, the Empress replied. And she will have allies who share that vision. Ben returned to Titan's Edge a month later, but his life had changed forever. The settlement had grown into a major diplomatic center, with permanent embassies from dozens of species. His workshop remained at the heart of it all, a symbol of how simple human values had reshaped galactic politics. Arya visited whenever her duties allowed, and their friendship remained the foundation of the new alliance. She was changing too, growing into the kind of leader the galaxy needed. The frightened child Ben had sheltered was becoming the wise ruler, who would guide both their peoples into an uncertain but hopeful future. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the Draconic Empire from a realm of conquest to a coalition of equals, they would point to grand battles and diplomatic summits. But Ben knew the truth. It had all begun in a small workshop on a forgotten moon, when a mechanic chose to help a lost child and discovered that kindness, once freely given, could reshape the destiny of stars.